Chapter 41. Familiar Sights. They reached the edge of the desert the next night, on schedule, then followed the river for 3 days, all the way to the sea. It took them still farther north, and the October chill turned as cold as any winter Talia had ever felt. David unpacked city-made Arctic gear of shiny silver mylar, which Talia wore over her handmade sweater, her only possession left in the smoke. She was glad she'd dropped off to sleep in the night before the specials had invaded, so it hadn't been lost that day like everything else. The night spent on board seemed to pass quickly. On this journey, there were none of Shay's cryptic clues to puzzle through, no bushfires to escape, and no antique rusty machines ascending to scare her to death. The world seemed to be empty except for the occasional ruins, as if Talia and Dave were the last people alive. They augmented their diet with fish caught from the river, and Talia roasted a rabbit on a fire she'd built herself. She watched David repair his leather clothes and decided she would never be able to manage a needle and thread well. He taught her how to tell time and direction from the stars, and she showed him how to open the expert software in the boards to optimize them for night travel. At the sea they turned south, heading down the northern reaches of the same coastal railway that Talia had followed on her way to the smoke. David said it had once stretched unbroken all the way back to Talia's home city and beyond. But now there were huge gaps in the track, and new cities built on the sea, so they had to travel inland more than once. But David knew the rivers, the spurs of the railroad, and the other metal paths that the Rusties had left behind, so they made good time toward their goal. Only the weather stopped them. After a few days' travel down the coast, a dark, threatening mountain of clouds appeared over the ocean. At first the storm seemed reluctant to come ashore, building up its nerve over a slow 24 hours. The air pressure changing in a way that made the hoverboard jittery to ride. The storm gave plenty of warning, but when it finally arrived, it was much worse than Talia had imagined weather could be. She'd never faced a full-force hurricane, except from within the solid structures of her inland city. It was another lesson of nature's savage power. For 3 days, Talia and David huddled in a plastic tent in the shelter of a rock outcrop, burning chemical glow sticks for heat and light, hoping the magnets in the hoverboards wouldn't bring down a lightning strike. For the first hours, the drama of the storm kept them fascinated, amazed by its power, wondering when the next peal of thunder would shake the cliffs. Then the driving rain became simply monotonous. They spent a whole day talking to each other about anything and everything, but especially their childhoods, until Talia was sure that she understood David better than anyone else she'd ever known. On their 3rd day trapped in the tent, they had a terrible fight. Talia could never remember about what. They ended when David stormed out and stood alone in the icy wind for a solid hour. When he finally returned, it took him hours to stop shivering, even wrapped in her arms. "We're taking too long," he finally said. Talia squeezed tighter. It took time to prepare subjects for the operation, especially when they were older than 16. But Dr. Cable wouldn't wait forever to turn David's parents. Every day the storm delayed them, there was a greater chance that Maddie and Az had already gone under the knife. For Shay, the perfect age for turning, the odds were even worse. "We'll get there, don't worry. They measure me every week for a year before I was supposed to turn. It takes time to do it right." A shudder passed through his body. "Talia, what if they don't bother to do it right?" The storm ended the next morning, and they emerged to find the world's colors had been transformed. The clouds were bright pink, the grass an unearthly green, and the ocean darker than Talia had ever seen it, marked only by the foam crests of waves and a peppering of driftwood driven into the sea by the wind. They rode all day to make up for lost time, in a state of shock, amazed that the world could still exist after the storm. Then the railway turned inland, and a few nights later they reached the rusty ruins. The ruins looked smaller, as if the spires had shrunk since Talia had left them behind more than a month before. Headed to the smoke with nothing but Shay's note in a knapsack full of spag bowl. As she and David passed through the dark streets, the ghosts of the rescues no longer seemed to threaten from the windows. "The first time I came here at night, this place really scared me," she said. David nodded. "It's kind of creepy how well preserved it all is. Of all the ruins I've seen, it looks the most recent." They sprayed it with something to keep it up for school trips. And that was her city in a nutshell, Talia realized. Nothing left to itself. Everything turned into a bribe, a warning, or a lesson. They stowed most of their gear in a collapsed building far from the center, a crumbling place that even truant uglies would probably avoid. Packing only water purifiers, a flashlight, and a few food packets, David had never been any closer to the city than the ruins, so Tally took the lead for once, following the vein of iron that Shay had shown her months before. "Do you ever think we'll be friends again?" she asked as they hiked toward the river, lugging the boards for the first time the entire trip.
"You and Shay? Of course.
"Even after you and me?"
Once we've rescued her from the specials, I figure she'll forgive you for just about anything."
Tally was silent. Shay had already guessed that Tally had betrayed the smoke. She doubted anything would ever make up for that. Once they reached the river, they shot down the white water at top speed, glad to be finally free of the heavy saddlebags. With the spray hitting her face, the roar of the water all around her, Tally could almost imagine this was one of her expeditions, back when she was a carefree city kid, and not a... What was she now? No longer a spy, and she couldn't call herself a Smoky anymore. Hardly a pretty. But she didn't feel like an ugly either. She was nothing in particular, but at least she had a purpose. The city came into view. "There it is," she called to David over the churning water. "But you've seen cities before, right?"
"I've been this close to a few, but not much closer."
Tally gazed down at the familiar skyline, the slender trails of fireworks silhouetting the party towers and mansions. She felt a pang of something like homesickness, but much worse. The sight of New Pretty Town had once filled her with longing. Now the skyline was like a vacant shell, all its promises gone. Like David, she had lost her home. But unlike the smoke, her city still existed, right in front of her eyes, but emptied of everything it had once meant. "We've got a few hours before sunrise," she said. "Want to take a look at special circumstances?"
"The sooner the better,"
David said. Tally nodded, her eyes tracing the familiar patterns of light and darkness surrounding the city. There was time to make it there and back before daybreak. "Let's go." They followed the river as far as the ring of trees and brush that separated Uglyville from the suburbs. The greenbelt was the best to travel without being seen, and a good ride as well. "Don't go so fast," David hissed from behind as she whipped through the trees. She slowed down. "You don't have to whisper. No one comes here at night. It's ugly territory, and they're all in bed unless they're tricking."
"Okay,"
he said.
"but shouldn't we be more careful about hoverpaths?"
"Hoverpaths?" "David, hoverboards work everywhere in the city. There's a metal grid under the whole thing."
"Oh, right."
Tally smiled. She'd been so used to living in David's world. It was good to be explaining things to him for once. "What's the matter? Can't keep up?" David grinned.
"Try me."
Tally turned and shot ahead, cutting a zigzag path between the tall poplars, letting her reflexes guide her. She remembered her 2 hovercar rides to special circumstances. They'd flown across the greenbelt on a far side of town, then out to the transport ring, the industrial zone between the middle pretty suburbs and the outer Crumblyville. The hard part would be getting across the Burbs, a risky place to have an ugly face. Luckily, middle pretties went to bed early. Most of them, anyway. She raced David halfway around the greenbelt, until the lights from the big hospital sat directly across the river from them. Tally remembered the first terrible morning, yanked away from the promised operation, flown out to be interrogated, her future pulled out from under her. She made a grim face, realizing that this time she was actually going out looking for special circumstances. A tinkle passed through her as they left the greenbelt. A minuscule part of Tally still expected her interface ring to warn her that she was leaving Uglyville. How had she worn that stupid thing for 16 years? It had seemed such a part of her back then. But now the idea of being tracked and monitored and advised every minute of the day repelled Tally. "Stick close," she said to David. "This is the part where you should whisper." As a littlie, Tally had lived in the middle pretty burbs with Sol and Ellie, but back then her world had been pathetically tiny. A few parks, a path to the littlie school, one corner of the greenbelt where she would sneak in to spy on uglies. Like the rusty ruins, the neat row of houses and gardens seemed much smaller to her now, an endless village of doll houses. They skimmed the rooftops, crouching low. If anybody was awake, going for a late-night run or walking a dog, they wouldn't be looking up, hopefully. Their boards barely a hand's breadth above the housetops, The patterns of shingles passed underneath hypnotically. All they encountered were nesting birds and a few cats, who flew or scrambled out of their way in surprise. The Burbs ended suddenly, a last band of parks fading into the transport ring, where underground factories stuck their heads above ground and cargo trucks drove concrete roads all day and night. Tally lofted her board and gained speed. "Tally," David hissed. "They'll see us." "Relax. Those trucks are automatic. Nobody comes out here, especially at night." He stared down at the lumbering vehicles nervously. "Look, they don't even have headlights." She pointed down at a giant road train passing below, the only light coming from it in a dim red flicker from underneath, the navigation later reading the barcodes painted onto the road. They rode on, David still anxious at the sight of moving vehicles below. Soon, a familiar landmark rose above the industrial wasteland. "See that hill? Special Circumstances is just below it. We'll climb up top and take a look." The hill was too steep to put a factory on, and apparently too big and solid to flatten with explosives and bulldozers. So it stood out in the flat plain like a lopsided pyramid, steep on one side and sloping on the other, covered with scrub and brown grass. They skimmed up the sloping side, dodging a few boulders and hard-scrabbled trees, until they reached the top. From this height, Tally could see all the way back to New Prettytown, the glowing disk of islands about as big as a dinner plate. The outer city was in darkness, and below her, the low brown buildings of Special Circumstances were lit only with the harsh glare of security lights. "Down there," she said, her voice falling to a whisper.
Doesn't look like much.
"Most of it's underground. I don't know how far down it goes." She stared at the cluster of buildings in silence. From up here, Tally could see the perimeter wire clearly, stretching up around the buildings in an almost perfect square. That meant serious security. There weren't many barriers in the city, not that you could see anyway. If you weren't supposed to be someplace, your interface ring just politely warned you to move along.
That fence looks low enough to fly over.
Tally shook her head. "It's not a fence. It's a sensor wire. You get within 20 meters of it and the specials will know you're there. Same goes if you touch the ground inside it."
20 meters. Too high to clear on boards. So what do we do? Knock on the gate?
"There's no gate that I can see. I went in and out by hover car." David drummed his fingers on his board.
What about stealing one?
"A hover car?" Tally whistled. "That'd be a pretty good trick. I knew uglies who used to go joyriding, but not in Special Circumstances hover cars."
It's too bad we can't just jump down.
Tally narrowed her eyes. "Jump?"
From here. Get on your hoverboards back at the bottom of the hill, zoom up at maximum speed, then jump off from about this spot. We'd probably hit that big building dead center.
Dead is right. We'd splat.
Yeah, I guess. Even with our crash bracelets, our arms would probably yank out of their sockets after a fall like that. We'd need parachutes.
Tally looked down, plotting trajectories from the hilltop, shushing David when he started to speak again, the wheels in her brain spinning. She remembered the party at Garbo Mansion, which seemed like years ago. Finally, she allowed herself to smile. "Not parachutes, David. Bungee jackets."